They never wanted you to hear this. Not then. Not now. What burned in the woods of Vermont in the summer of 1889 wasn't just an orphanage, it was a vault of secrets. Secrets that screamed as they turned to ash. When the fire consumed Whispering Pines, the world was told it was an accident. But men who stood in those ruins saw something else: chains blackened with soot, journals still warm with ink, instruments slick with the memory of blood. And when they realized what they had found, they shut the doors of history, locked them, and buried the key. But tonight I'm handing you that key. You will hear about a place where children weren't raised, but broken, where the mask of Christian charity hid a machinery of control, and where the word orphan became code for subject. This is no ghost story. This is no legend. This is the architecture of power, disguised as mercy. And once you see the blueprint, you'll start recognizing it everywhere: past, present, future. Whispering Pines was born after the Civil War, a time when America bled with fatherless children and broken families. What better stage for an experiment than the unwanted? What better camouflage than charity? The building rose from donations of railroad tycoons and timber barons, men who didn't give away money, but invested it. And what they built wasn't a refuge. It was a laboratory. At the center of it all, Dr. Ezekiel Harrington, a surgeon who had seen too much death on the battlefield. He returned from war with new theories: that human weakness could be cut out like a tumor, that the mind could be bent, reshaped, perfected under pressure. And when he ran out of soldiers to operate on, he found easier prey: children. The community applauded him. Local papers praised him. Church sermons held his work up as proof of progress. And when visitors came, they were shown smiling boys and girls who memorized Bible verses, stitched quilts, and sang hymns in unison. But what the visitors never saw was the basement, the reflection chambers, the wet stone walls, the place where silence itself became the scalpel. The truth is this: Whispering Pines was not destroyed by fire. Fire only revealed what was already dead inside. And if you keep listening, you'll understand why this was never supposed to reach your ears. Imagine walking into a building where every surface lies to you. The brick walls spoke of permanence. The polished chapel pews whispered of salvation. The front parlor, with its lace curtains and portraits of benefactors, staged a picture of virtue so convincing that no one thought to look deeper. But the deeper you went, the more the house turned against you. The air grew colder, the plaster cracked, and beneath the wooden floors, something rotted. Whispering Pines was built as a three-tier world. The top floor was heaven dormitories for the good children, those deemed redeemable. The ground floor was purgatory classrooms, kitchens, workshops where discipline was strict but survivable. And the basement was hell reserved for the condemned. Boys and girls Harrington labeled as defective, dangerous, unworthy of normal care. This was not a system of charity. It was hierarchy, a pyramid of power. The same pyramid you see echoed across history. Pharaohs at the top, laborers at the base, and the sacrifice sealed in tombs beneath. Harrington was no innovator. He was a disciple of an ancient pattern, one that feeds itself on human suffering under the excuse of order. Every inspection from the state was theater. A handful of bright-eyed children rehearsed lines of gratitude. Dormitories were scrubbed, gardens trimmed, hymnals polished. Officials signed off their reports with smiles, never questioning why certain wings remained locked, or why only select children were brought forward. Harrington knew something about men in power. They prefer illusions that confirm their righteousness. They do not look for what would damn them. And so the basement thrived. The reflection chambers were not mere punishment cells. They were crucibles, designed to break identity. Damp, lightless, soundless except for the occasional drip of water on stone. Children kept in these chambers lost track of days, of names, of themselves. Harrington wrote in his journals that the child must be emptied before it can be filled anew. He stripped them of memory, dignity, and willpower, not out of cruelty alone, but to see if he could rewrite them. You see, this was never about saving orphans. It was about perfecting control, testing whether human nature itself could be bent into obedience. Whispering Pines was a prototype not for a home, but for a system. And when the fire came, it wasn't the flames that terrified the authorities. It was the realization that the journals, the instruments, the bones, they all told a truth too dangerous to release. A truth that echoes louder the closer we listen. The question you should ask is not what happened at Whispering Pines. The question is, why was it allowed to happen for 18 years? Fires may destroy buildings, but silence protects legacies. And for nearly 2 decades, a whole community chose not to see. Think about that. Farmers delivering milk, merchants supplying goods, preachers blessing the children from the pulpit. Everyone touched the edges of this place, but no one pierced its center. Why? Because Harrington offered something more powerful than safety. He offered absolution. He told wealthy donors that their money could purify broken children. He told politicians that his methods would reduce crime before it began. He told church leaders that he was not punishing sin, but excising it. Everyone was fed a lie tailored to their hunger. And so the town conspired through apathy. Mothers who had lost sons in the war whispered, "At least someone is taking care of them." Fathers ruined by debt told themselves, "Better there than the streets." Even state officials who signed reports must have felt an unease in their stomachs. But unease is not the same as courage. And in the vacuum of courage, evil multiplies. The basement journals prove it. Harrington documented not only the punishments: days without food, weeks without sunlight, children forced to kneel in water until their legs collapsed, but also the outcomes. He wrote as though he were a scientist in a grand laboratory. Subject 14 ceased weeping after day 22, he recorded. Obedience achieved after isolation and moral examination. Do you understand the weight of that? He was not seeing children. He was seeing data points. And this is where the horror deepens. Harrington's findings did not die with him. Those journals, charred but legible, were seized and stored in state archives, hidden from the public. Yet fragments resurfaced in the early 20th century in academic papers on criminology, in whispered conversations among prison reformers, in methods quietly adopted by military training programs. The line between orphanage torture and institutional discipline is thinner than you think. Whispering Pines was not erased, it was absorbed. Its darkness diluted into respectable channels, reborn under the language of behavioral science and moral correction. The system didn't burn down. It evolved. And here's the truth you must sit with. What was done to children in the basements of Vermont is still being done, in subtler forms, to entire populations. The methods have changed. The cages have become invisible. But the goal remains the same. Break the will, then rebuild it in the image of obedience. When you strip the story of its Victorian shadows, you begin to see a blueprint that is disturbingly familiar. Harrington's reflection chambers were not relics of a cruel century. They were prototypes of psychological control techniques refined and scaled for mass use. Look around. The architecture of Whispering Pines did not die in fire. It migrated. It metastasized. Start with the foundation. Isolation. Harrington learned that when a child is cut off from light, sound, and touch, their mind unravels. Identity crumbles. Resistance dissolves. Today, we call it solitary confinement. Prison systems across America use it not for the violent, but for the disobedient. Weeks, months, years. And the journals of Whispering Pines read like a prophecy of that very system. Then comes ritual. Harrington forced children to repeat prayers until their throats cracked, to confess sins that were never theirs, to thank him for punishments he inflicted. Why? Because ritual reshapes thought. Break the natural rhythm of the body, sleep, hunger, speech, and replace it with the rhythm of authority. And soon the victim cannot tell where their own will ends and the master's will begins. You think ritual only belongs in churches and temples? Look at corporate pledges, school recitations, military drills. The language is different, but the function is the same. Conditioning obedience. And finally, classification. At Whispering Pines, children were labeled mildly defective or severely compromised. Their fate was sealed by that word. Today, entire populations are categorized the same way data-driven metrics that decide who gets opportunity and who is discarded. Harrington labeled children defective to justify experiments. Modern systems label men as risks, liabilities, non-compliant. The label is the sentence. The sentence is the cage. Do you see the pattern yet? Harrington wasn't just an aberration, a lone madman hiding in Vermont. He was a node in a chain, a link in humanity's darker obsession with control. His orphanage was a prototype, but the prototype worked. It proved that fear, ritual, and isolation could rebuild human identity into something compliant, something useful. And once knowledge like that exists, it does not vanish. It moves. It adapts. It waits for the next institution hungry enough to use it. That is why Whispering Pines was buried not to protect the innocent, but to protect the method. And tonight, by hearing this, you are tearing open the vault of that method. The fire. On paper, it was an accident, a lamp overturned, curtains catching, timber beams feeding the blaze. That's the official line. But official lines are the graves of truth. Witness accounts from that night tell a different story. Flames rising not from the parlor or the chapel, but from below, from the basement itself. The very chambers where Harrington buried his experiments erupted first, as if the building was trying to purge its own secrets. Survivors spoke of screams before the fire reached the upper floors. Children locked in the reflection chambers, pounding on doors that would not open. Some claimed to hear metallic groans, restraints snapping, bolts tearing loose in the heat. One boy who escaped, half mad from smoke and terror, babbled that the fire wasn't started by accident, but by hands from within. That some of the older children, those who had endured the chambers for years, set the blaze themselves. If that's true, then the fire was not destruction. It was rebellion. And yet, when the smoke cleared, the story was buried under ash and lies. Firefighters found evidence, restraint devices bolted into stone, surgical tools still red though untouched by flame, journals stacked in fireproof cases. They handed them to officials, expecting outrage. But outrage never came. The coroner's report, which spoke of bones bent in unnatural ways, of skull fractures not caused by falling timber, was sealed. The newspapers printed only half-truths: tragic accident, orphanage consumed, many lost. No mention of experiments. No mention of torture. No mention of the darkness that smoldered long before the fire ever sparked. Why? Because exposure would have shaken the pillars of Vermont society. Wealthy donors who had financed Harrington would have been implicated. Church leaders who praised him would have been disgraced. State officials who ignored the signs would have been destroyed. Better then to silence the dead than to shame the living. And so the fire became a cleansing narrative. An accident. A tragedy. A chapter closed. But the truth was never closed, it was sealed, catalogued, hidden. Whispering Pines burned, but its legacy was not ashes. It was ink, paper, memory, a record that still speaks to anyone willing to open the vault. The question is, why was the vault open now? Why, after 130 years, are these journals surfacing? And what do they demand of us, the ones who dare to look inside? The journals. That is where the real horror lies. Charred at the edges, but intact like bones pulled from a grave that refused to stay buried. Page after page, written in Harrington's immaculate hand, cataloging not chaos but design. He wasn't improvising. He was engineering. He divided his program into stages, each with a purpose, each with results. Stage 1, isolation. Days in the reflection chambers until the child stopped resisting. Hunger, thirst, and silence grinding away the edges of the self. He wrote, "The spirit fractures quietly. By the 5th day, most cease speaking to themselves. By the 10th, they begin speaking to me." Stage 2, confession. Not a religious confession, but a psychological stripping. Children were forced to admit to inherent wickedness, to beg for reform, to denounce their own memories as lies. Imagine being 9 years old and told your own recollections are defective, that your suffering is proof of your corruption. That is not discipline, it is inversion of reality itself. Stage 3, reconstruction. Once broken, Harrington introduced what he called moral examinations. These were scripted dialogues where the child was rewarded only for repeating his words back. Parrot him, survive. Question him, return to isolation. Over time, the child's voice became his logic, his morality, his worldview. Harrington wrote, "The child becomes a vessel. Into emptiness, I pour correction." Do you feel the chill of this? It is the blueprint of indoctrination, not just for orphans in a basement, but for any society that seeks obedient citizens. Strip identity. Replace it with a script. Condition obedience. Stage 4, experimentation. This is where the journals descend into true darkness. Needles, scalpels, drugs administered not to heal but to test. He injected stimulants, depressants, tonics brewed from opium. He recorded their effects on mood, memory, aggression. He noted which substances made children docile, which made them compliant, which erased resistance altogether. He was not just studying psychology, he was probing chemistry. A century before pharmacological control became mainstream, Harrington was already searching for the formula. And here is the unbearable truth. These notes did not stay buried. Some techniques echo in 20th century intelligence programs, in experiments carried out behind locked government doors. Harrington may have been erased from history, but his methodology lived on, clothed in new names, hidden behind new walls. The fire didn't stop the system, fed it. Do not comfort yourself with the thought that this horror was confined to one orphanage in the forests of Vermont. That is the lie of history, that evil lives only in forgotten corners, in madmen and monsters. The truth is colder. What Harrington tested in secret was later adopted in public, wearing new uniforms and bearing new names. Consider the early 20th century. Reform schools and juvenile detention centers spread across America, each claiming to transform wayward youth into productive citizens. Their methods: isolation, repetition, humiliation, eerily familiar echoes of Whispering Pines. Children locked in bare rooms for days, forced to march in silence, to chant moral lessons until their voices broke. Different century, different language, same architecture of control. Look at prisons. The reflection chamber became solitary confinement. Officials justified it as humane: no beatings, no chains, just silence. But silence, as Harrington proved, is its own form of violence. Extended isolation fractures the mind, dissolves memory, reshapes identity. His journals could have been used as manuals for the wardens who designed these systems. Perhaps they were. Look at schools. Rows of desks, bells that slice the day into segments, standardized recitations. Children rewarded for repetition, punished for deviation. Do you think that is an accident? Or is it the echo of a method that proved effective at Whispering Pines? Strip individuality, reward obedience, condition compliance. And then, the military. Drill sergeants breaking recruits down through exhaustion, humiliation, repetition before building them back up as soldiers who move, think, and kill on command. It is Harrington's formula, scaled to armies. Break identity. Replace it with the script of authority. The fire may have buried the name Whispering Pines, but its ghost walks among us. Not in haunted forests, but in the design of institutions that claim to protect us, to educate us, to rehabilitate us. Institutions that whisper the same message Harrington scrawled in his journal. The spirit must be broken before it can be shaped. Do you see now? The orphanage was not the end. It was the seed, and the forest that grew from that seed surrounds you today. You may not hear the screams of children in the basement, but you see the results in the eyes of men who have forgotten who they are, shaped into something smaller, something obedient. You must understand this. The system was never about the children alone. Harrington knew something most men refuse to admit, that control over the few teaches you how to dominate the many. Whispering Pines was not just a prison for orphans. It was a proving ground for power. Breaking a child in isolation is not merely cruelty, it is research. Research into the machinery of the human mind. Research into the thresholds of pain, silence, hunger, obedience. Once you know the levers, once you know how far a person can bend before they shatter, you no longer need chains. The cage becomes invisible. The prisoner carries it inside. That is why the journals matter. Harrington didn't just describe torture, he described results. He measured how long it took before defiance collapsed into surrender. He calculated the sequence of punishment and reward required to turn a child into a tool. His notes read like equations. X days of hunger plus Y hours of ritual equals Z compliance. This was not madness. This was mathematics. And mathematics can be replicated. Do you see the elegance of it? Break identity on an individual scale, and you hold a method to fracture populations. Replace the reflection chamber with mass isolation, segregation, censorship, propaganda. Replace forced confessions with endless repetition of official narratives. Replace scalpels with subtler tools, schools, entertainment, ideology. The blueprint remains the same. The basement becomes the world. And here is the most dangerous truth. You have walked through these basements yourself. Not of stone and iron, but of information and ritual. The constant hum of distraction, the division into categories, the demand to confess, whether through public apologies, compliance to policy, or silent obedience to systems you did not choose. You are living inside a grander Whispering Pines, one designed not to break orphans, but to pacify entire nations. Remember, the few children in Vermont were only the beginning. The lesson was this: if you can strip away the soul of one, you can strip away the soul of millions. And that, my friend, is why this knowledge is dangerous. Because once you see the design, you can no longer walk through this world blind. You either resist it or you are consumed by it. By now, you feel it, that pull in your chest, that unease gnawing at the edges of your certainty. You've glimpsed the pattern, and once the pattern is visible, you cannot return to ignorance. That is the danger. That is also the initiation. Because this is not just a story of a forgotten fire in Vermont. This is a mirror being forced in front of you. Harrington's orphans were locked in stone basements. You, today, are locked in basements of another kind, designed not with bricks, but with illusions. The methods are cleaner now, quieter, more sophisticated. But the endgame is the same. Fracture the individual, weaken the will, rebuild obedience. And here is the razor-edge truth most men never notice. They live and die within cages of ritual, distraction, and silence, never questioning why the walls are there, never realizing they were constructed deliberately. You are here because you are not most men. You are here because you chose to listen. And once you hear this, you cannot unhear it. That is why I'm asking you to take a step right now that most will never take. To lock this transformation into your very identity. Go into the comments and write these words twice. I walk out of the basement. Why twice? Because repetition seals truth. Once for the world to see, once for your own mind to remember. Those words are more than a phrase. They are a declaration, a rejection of the invisible chambers built around you, a vow that you will not live as a subject in someone else's experiment. Understand this: when you type it, you are not merely engaging with a video. You are marking yourself as a man who saw the design, who chose to break it rather than be broken by it. You are stepping out of the reflection chamber. You are refusing to confess to sins that were never yours. And that choice matters. Because if you do not claim your will, someone else will. They always have. They always will. Harrington proved it in stone chambers lit by oil lamps. Today, others prove it in ways more subtle, but no less ruthless. So type it, twice. I walk out of the basement, and feel the weight of what you've just chosen. Survivors. That word suggests hope. But what escaped Whispering Pines were not children in the ordinary sense. They were fragments of children, bodies alive, spirits scarred, memories fractured. And yet, in their broken voices, we catch the clearest glimpse of what happened in those chambers. The first testimonies surfaced decades later, when elderly men and women finally spoke of the years they were forbidden to mention. One woman, her name lost in the archives, recorded only as SD, recounted being locked in a chamber at 7 years old. She said the damp stone walls wept like the dead, and she learned to drink from them when the bread and water rations stopped. She remembered counting her own heartbeats in the dark, because it was the only proof she still existed. Another, a man identified as TK, spoke of how silence was worse than pain. After a while, he said, you start inventing voices just to hear something. And then, when Dr. Harrington came, I couldn't tell if he was real or just another voice I made. Do you see it? Isolation didn't just punish, it rewrote reality itself. Some testimonies mention experiments more brutal than even the journals describe. Injections that made the body tremble uncontrollably. Strange metal instruments used on the skull, accompanied by lectures on moral defects of the brain. Children tied in pairs and forced to fight for scraps of food, while Harrington observed their natural dominance instincts. These details never appeared in official records, but they surfaced in whispered accounts too consistent to dismiss, too grotesque to fabricate. And perhaps the most chilling testimony comes from a survivor who described the night of the fire. She said some of the older boys had planned it for months, stealing kerosene, hiding matches, waiting for the perfect moment. They said if the doctor broke us, we'd break the house, she recalled. And so they did. But freedom did not follow. Those who escaped were taken by state authorities, scattered, silenced, threatened with imprisonment if they ever spoke of what they endured. This is why history remembers only a fire. Because the survivors were broken twice, once in the basement, once by the silence imposed afterward. And yet, in their scattered words, we see the truth. The fire was not tragedy alone. It was revolt. The orphans did not wait to be saved. They saved themselves the only way they could, by burning down the prison built to consume them. If the children lit the fire, the state and the church smothered the flames of truth. What burned in Vermont was not only an orphanage, it was the reputation of men who wore collars and titles, who signed checks and decrees. And reputations, in the architecture of power, are more sacred than lives. Understand this: Dr. Harrington did not operate in a vacuum. He was praised in pulpits. He was endorsed in newspapers. He received funding from railroad magnates who saw moral correction as an investment in a disciplined workforce. The church called him a pioneer of Christian Science. Politicians called him a reformer. For 18 years, Whispering Pines was upheld as a symbol of progress. What would happen if the truth had surfaced? Their entire structure of credibility would have collapsed overnight. So they buried it. The coroner's report sealed. The journals locked away. Survivors silenced under threats of imprisonment. The official narrative, an accidental fire, tragic loss of life, was printed and repeated until the lie hardened into history. And every man with power walked away clean. But they gained more than clean hands. They gained knowledge. Whispering Pines had demonstrated a methodology that worked. Break identity, reforge obedience. That knowledge was too valuable to discard. And so, while the orphanage was erased from the record, its techniques were quietly disseminated into institutions that served church and state alike. Reformatories adopted the rituals. Prisons perfected the isolation. Schools absorbed the classifications. And the military transformed obedience into a science. The church benefited, too. Whispering Pines proved the power of ritualized confession not to absolve sin, but to weaponize guilt. Harrington's chambers were confessionals stripped of grace, laboratories of control where guilt was manufactured and wielded like a blade. Do you think the church failed to notice? Or do you see, now, how the line between salvation and submission blurs when institutions hold the pen? And the state? It learned that darkness, when managed properly, need never see the light. Documents can be classified, testimonies suppressed, tragedies rewritten. The Whispering Pines fire became the model for a new kind of governance. Not transparency, but selective memory. Not justice, but containment. Ask yourself, how many other tragedies have been buried the same way? How many fires have burned across history, their smoke disguising not accident but design? Whispering Pines was not the first, and it was certainly not the last. History likes to pretend that darkness dies in the past, but darkness doesn't die, it adapts. The basements of Whispering Pines did not remain in Vermont soil. They were replanted, refined, and given new names under the banner of progress. By the mid-20th century, Harrington's crude methods had been dressed in the language of psychology, psychiatry, and national security. Consider this: the techniques of isolation, forced confession, sensory manipulation once scrawled in the margins of a doctor's leather journal were suddenly appearing in academic papers. Only the words changed. Moral reconstruction became behavioral conditioning. Breaking the will became modifying responses. The same machinery, polished and clinical, was now treated as legitimate science. During wartime, governments saw immediate use. Prisoners of war were subjected to enhanced interrogation that mirrored Whispering Pines step for step. Deprivation, silence, endless questioning until the subject not only complied but began to doubt their own memory. Soldiers returned with reports of camps where captives would confess to anything simply to hear another human voice. Does that sound familiar? It should. It is Harrington's chamber reborn. And then came the laboratories funded in secrecy. Projects that tested how long a man could endure darkness, how easily sleep could be fractured, how far identity could be dissolved under chemical and psychological assault. These were not fringe experiments, they were state-sanctioned, funded, protected. Each discovery brought the same conclusion Whispering Pines had reached decades earlier. The human mind is clay, and the right hands can mold it into anything. But here lies the deeper horror. It wasn't only enemies who were studied. Civilians became subjects. Schools tested obedience under rigid regimens. Factories experimented with breaking individuality to maximize efficiency. Even hospitals, cloaked in white coats and sterile light, carried echoes of those chambers patients silenced, isolated, told their suffering was imaginary until they accepted the narrative imposed on them. And all of this was justified by a single word: progress. A word so clean, so righteous, that it concealed the soot still clinging to it from the ashes of Whispering Pines. Do you see now? What burned in Vermont was never destroyed. It was institutionalized. Hidden in plain sight, the orphanage was erased, but the blueprint became immortal. And every time you hear a government promise safety, or a corporation promise efficiency, or an institution promise order, remember, those promises were once whispered to children as the lock clicked on a basement door. Look around you now, in this very moment, and ask yourself, how different is your world from the world of those children in Vermont? The walls are no longer stone and dripping with cold, but the chambers remain. They are digital, glowing, silent prisons designed not to restrain your body but your mind. Consider the structure. At Whispering Pines, children were stripped of freedom, categorized, then reshaped into obedient vessels. Today, men are categorized by algorithms, tracked by data, and reshaped not with whips and starvation, but with dopamine and distraction. The chamber is your screen. The confessions are your clicks, your searches, your thoughts fed back to you until you forget which were truly yours. Harrington forced his orphans to beg for their reformation. Today, men beg for validation in the form of likes, followers, meaningless approval from systems that feed you what keeps you compliant. You are rewarded not for truth, but for conformity. Just as the twins Sarah and Rebecca were punished for resisting the narrative of their moral deficiency, you too are punished when you deviate from the acceptable script through censorship, through ostracism, through silence imposed not by shackles, but by invisibility. Do you understand what's happening? The same mechanisms that once operated in hidden basements are now everywhere, invisible precisely because they feel normal. The chamber is no longer a punishment. It is marketed as convenience. Isolation is called privacy. Control is branded as safety. And you, like the children, are told to be grateful for the system that holds you. This is why you feel that gnawing sense of unease, that suspicion that life has been hollowed out. Because deep inside, you recognize the design. You know something is watching, measuring, deciding what you deserve to see, hear, and become. And just like those children, your rebellion has been anticipated, categorized, and neutralized. But here is the difference. You are not 8 years old, shivering in a stone cell. You are a man, and once you see the design, you are no longer just a subject of it. You are standing at the threshold of choice. That's why this knowledge is dangerous. That's why so few dare to truly look. Because once you recognize the chamber you're in, you can never pretend it isn't there. Every descent has a turning point, the place where you either surrender to the current or force yourself to rise against it. The children of Whispering Pines had no such choice. Their will was stolen, their resistance crushed before it could even bloom. But you are not a child in chains. You are a man standing in the wreckage of the same system, staring into its reflection across centuries. The question is not whether the chamber exists, it does. The question is whether you will keep lying to yourself, telling yourself you are free, while the lock clicks shut one turn at a time. The truth is harsher. Freedom has always been a battlefield, and every institution, church, state, corporation fights to control it. They have studied obedience longer than you have been alive. They have perfected Harrington's blueprint into a machine so subtle you thank it while it enslaves you. That is why this moment matters. You are not here to be entertained. You are here because part of you, perhaps the last unbroken part, still hungers for truth, still senses the chains tightening. And here is where the transformation begins. Not when you passively listen, but when you act, when you declare symbolically that you are no longer just another subject of the chamber. I want you to write in the comments below twice the phrase, "I do not belong to the chamber." Write it once for the child you once were, who still whispers beneath the surface. And write it again for the man you are now, claiming ownership of his own mind. Do this not for me, but as a marker to yourself, a digital scar that proves you chose to step outside the pattern, even if only for a moment. Symbols matter. Harrington understood that. His punishments, his rituals, his forced confessions, they were all designed to break the symbolic identity of the child. But you can reverse that process. The phrase is not magic, it is resistance. It is the first refusal to kneel before a machine that demands your quiet submission. Most will hear these words and scroll away, numbed, distracted, swallowed again by the chamber. But a few, perhaps you will feel the weight of them. And that choice will divide your life into two eras. The years you were blind, and the years you began to see. There will be no comfort at the end of this path. Whispering Pines burned to the ground in 1889, but its embers smolder inside the architecture of our world. You followed me through its corridors, down into the reflection chambers, through the screams locked in journals and the silences buried by officials. And now, standing here, you see it for what it truly was: not an orphanage, not even a prison, but a prototype. What Harrington discovered, whether by cruelty or design, was a formula for control. Strip away freedom, impose isolation, rewrite identity through confession and ritual, and the subject becomes clay. That formula did not die in Vermont. It was absorbed, perfected, and scaled until it no longer needed basements or iron locks. It needed only belief. A system becomes unstoppable not when it terrifies men, but when it convinces them it is protecting them. That is the final lock on the chamber door, the moment when submission feels like safety. Look at your world now. Surveillance towers dressed as cell phones. Obedience rituals disguised as corporate training. Isolation rituals marketed as social connection. You are surrounded by chambers without walls, and every day you are asked to bend, to confess, to surrender. Most men comply because the cage is invisible and the punishment is silence. Whispering Pines was not an aberration. It was a revelation, and its revelation has become your reality. Now you must decide what to do with this knowledge. You can scroll away, let the walls close in, pretend that ignorance is freedom. Many will. That is why the chamber thrives, because most would rather kneel in the dark than claw toward the light. But if you've come this far, I suspect you are not most men. I suspect you feel the burn in your chest that whispers, "I was not meant to be broken." So understand this. Once you see the design, you cannot unsee it. Once you hear the voices of those children echoing through time, you cannot pretend they were only ghosts. They were warnings, and you right now are the inheritor of their silence. You wanted forbidden knowledge. Now you have it. And knowledge is not comfort, it is responsibility. Whispering Pines never ended. It only changed its name. The question is, will you? If this descent into Whispering Pines struck something deep inside you, don't let it end here. Comment below the phrase you wrote, "I do not belong to the chamber," and read the words of others who chose the same resistance. That's how you'll know you are not alone in seeing through the design. Subscribe if you want to walk further down these forbidden corridors with me. Share this with someone who needs to wake up before the chamber swallows them whole. Every time you spread this story, you weaken the silence that has protected it for over a century. This channel is not entertainment, it is initiation. The question is, will you keep listening? Or will you go back to sleep?